Send the damn shit
west. You have to cross the desert.
Immediate support.
There's a convoy in about 52 hours.
Can survive for 52 hours like this.
Want to kill enemy?
You need to stay alive.
Come on, Marine.
Mine, 2017, a comprehensive film analysis. These are complete analyses and explanations of the entire film, examining its narrative structure, thematic ambitions, psychological dimensions, technical execution, and critical reception in exhaustive detail. Mine opens with a deceptive sense of calm, a vast North African desert horizon where two U.S. Marines, Mike Stevens and Tommy Madison, lie prone on a ridge preparing to execute a sniper assassination mission. The film immediately establishes its visual language, sweeping widescreen shots that dwarf the human figures, emphasizing their vulnerability in an indifferent landscape. The directors, Fabio Guaglione and Fabio Resinaro, making their feature debut, demonstrate immediate competence in building tension through spatial relationships and the precarious positioning of bodies in hostile terrain. The mission parameters are deliberately vague, placing the audience in the same position of incomplete knowledge as the soldiers themselves. Their target is part of what appears to be a wedding convoy, but the intelligence doesn't match the reality unfolding through their scopes. This discrepancy introduces the film's central preoccupation with the gap between perception and reality, between what we believe to be true and what actually exists beneath our feet. Mike's hesitation before pulling the trigger is the first crucial character beat, one that will echo throughout the entire narrative. Armie Hammer plays this moment with a subtle tremor of doubt, a flicker of conscience that compromises the mission's tactical execution. This hesitation is not merely a plot mechanism, but the film's thesis statement. The paralysis that comes from uncertainty, the moment when instinct and training collide with something deeper and less articulable. The compromised position forces the two soldiers to flee across the desert on foot, their extraction vehicle rendered unavailable by diplomatic and tactical constraints. The film shifts into survival mode, the camera tracking their desperate progress across terrain that seems designed to erase human presence. The desert here is not the romanticized landscape of Lawrence of Arabia, but a hostile, featureless expanse that offers no shelter and no mercy. The discovery of a warning sign indicating millions of buried landmines transforms the desert from merely inhospitable to actively murderous. The sign itself is a visual paradox, a human attempt to warn that has been weathered and neglected, barely legible, suggesting that the local population has long since abandoned any hope of making this terrain safe. It stands as a monument to forgotten conflicts, to wars that have ended but continue to claim victims. Tommy's recklessness in the minefield is the film's first major dramatic turn, and it's handled with brutal efficiency. His overconfidence, perhaps born of military training that teaches soldiers to project strength rather than acknowledge vulnerability, leads him to walk carelessly through the marked area. The explosion that takes his legs is sudden, loud, and horrifyingly matter-of-fact. The film does not linger on the gore but on the aftermath. The dust settling, the ringing silence, the dawning comprehension of irreversible catastrophe. Mike's instinctive rush toward his wounded comrade is arrested by the sound that will define the remainder of the film. The metallic click of a trigger mechanism beneath his boot. The sound design here is extraordinary in its precision, isolating that single mechanical noise against the desert wind. It is the sound of the world changing irrevocably, of a threshold crossed from which there is no return. The film freezes with Mike, and the audience freezes with him. Tommy's subsequent suicide is the film's darkest moment and its most narratively consequential. Unable to bear the pain of his injuries and the certainty of a slow death in the desert, he turns his weapon on himself. This act leaves Mike completely alone, his foot planted on what he believes to be a landmine, surrounded by the corpse of his friend and the infinite emptiness of the desert. The isolation is absolute, existential. The radio communication with base introduces the cruel timeline that structures the film's second act. 52 hours until rescue is possible, due to a massive sandstorm preventing any extraction attempt. This countdown becomes the film's temporal container, but it's also a psychological pressure cooker. 52 hours standing in one position, exposed to the elements, with nothing to do but think and remember and hallucinate. The broken GPS is a devastating detail, a technological failure that renders Mike's military training and equipment useless. He can communicate with the outside world, but cannot be located within it. This paradox of connection without location speaks to a broader theme of modern warfare. The illusion of control provided by technology, the harsh reality that systems fail when most needed. The sandstorm that arrives is the first of the film's set-piece survival challenges, and it's rendered with visceral intensity. The wind howls, sand scours exposed skin, visibility drops to zero, and Mike's radio is blown beyond reach. The sequence is a masterclass in creating tension from a static protagonist. Mike cannot move, cannot seek shelter, can only endure. His body becomes a fixed point around which chaos swirls. The loss of the radio is more than a practical problem. It severs Mike's last connection to human contact, to the reassuring voice of command, to the promise of rescue. From this point forward, he is truly alone, with only his thoughts for company. The film embraces this isolation fully, stripping away external narrative elements to focus entirely on the internal landscape of a man confronting his own mortality. The feral dogs that attack at night introduce a primal threat, a reminder that the desert is not empty, but inhabited by creatures that have adapted to its harshness. These sequences are genuinely terrifying, shot in near darkness with only the glint of eyes and the sound of snarling to locate the danger. Mike must defend himself while remaining perfectly still, his foot never leaving the mine, a physical constraint that transforms even simple self-defense into an impossible challenge. The desert sun becomes a character in its own right, a relentless antagonist that slowly cooks Mike alive. The film tracks his physical deterioration with unflinching attention. The sunburn that blisters and peels, the dehydration that cracks his lips and clouds his vision, the muscle fatigue that makes standing in place an act of heroic endurance. Makeup and prosthetics work is exceptional here, charting the body's breakdown over the 52-hour timeline. The appearance of the Berber, a Bedouin man who speaks fluent English and walks with a wooden leg, marks the film's shift from survival thriller to psychological and philosophical territory. Clint Dyer plays this role with an enigmatic calm that contrasts sharply with Mike's increasing desperation. The Berber's presence is immediately ambiguous. Is he real, a hallucination, or something in between? The film wisely never fully answers this question. The Berber's wooden leg is the first clue to his significance. He lost his leg to a landmine, the same threat that now holds Mike immobilized. Unlike Mike, however, the Berber has moved on with his life, adapting to his loss rather than remaining defined by it. His physical mobility, despite his amputation, stands in pointed contrast to Mike's paralysis despite his intact body. The image of the two men, one missing a leg but free, one whole but frozen, is the film's most potent visual metaphor. The Berber's repeated assertion that Mike is a lucky man initially seems cruel, even absurd. A man standing on a landmine for 2 days, watching his friend die, being attacked by dogs, slowly dying of thirst. How is this luck? But the Berber's perspective comes from lived experience of the region's ongoing tragedy. He has lost his daughter to a mine. He has lost his leg. Mike, by contrast, still has his life and the possibility of a future, if only he has the courage to take the next step. The philosophical advice the Berber offers is cryptic but consistent. Accept the consequences, take the step, move forward regardless of what might happen. This is not fatalism, but a kind of radical acceptance, a recognition that paralysis in the face of fear is a slower and surer death than any explosion. The Berber's wisdom is hard-earned, born of real loss, and it challenges Mike's military training, which values tactical patience and calculated risk. The hallucinations that increasingly plague Mike serve multiple narrative functions. They externalize his internal state, making visible the psychological deterioration that the constrained physical situation might otherwise obscure. They provide backstory, revealing through fragmented memories the childhood trauma that has shaped his character. And they blur the line between reality and imagination, preparing the audience for the film's final revelation. The flashbacks to Mike's childhood are the film's most controversial element among critics, but they serve a crucial structural purpose. They reveal an abusive father who beat both Mike and his mother, a pattern of violence and fear that left deep psychological scars. These scenes, featuring Jeff Bell as the brutal patriarch, are filmed with a different visual texture than the desert sequences, all harsh shadows and confined interiors, emphasizing the domestic prison Mike escaped by joining the military. The connection between Mike's childhood trauma and his present paralysis is made explicit through the film's editing. Match cuts link his kneeling position on the mine to other moments of kneeling, proposing to his girlfriend Jenny, crouching as a child before his father's rage. The visual repetition suggests that Mike has been frozen in this position his entire life, that the landmine is merely the physical manifestation of a psychological condition that has always existed. Jenny, played by Annabelle Wallis, exists in the film primarily through Mike's memories and hallucinations. Their relationship is presented in fragments. Moments of tenderness, moments of conflict, the unanswered proposal that hangs between them. Mike's inability to commit to Jenny mirrors his hesitation on the sniper mission and his paralysis on the mine, a pattern of arrested movement that defines his character across all domains of life. The toy soldiers that appear in Mike's hallucinations have been criticized as a touch obvious as a symbol, but their repetition throughout the film builds a symbolic vocabulary that pays off in the ending. The toy soldier represents childhood, certainly, but also the games men play with violence. The way military service can be an extension of boyish fantasies, the diminishment of human life to playthings in the hands of larger forces. The match cut that links Mike kneeling on the mine to Mike kneeling to propose to Jenny is the film's most explicit thematic statement. Both positions involve vulnerability, risk, the possibility of devastating rejection or destruction. The proposal, like the mine, represents a threshold. Step forward and everything changes, for better or worse. Mike's fear of commitment and his fear of death are presented as fundamentally the same fear. The fear of consequences, of irreversible action, of the unknown. The 52 hours of waiting are structured as a series of crises and respites, each challenge pushing Mike closer to his physical and psychological limits. The film's pacing in this section is deliberate, almost meditative, allowing the audience to feel the weight of time passing. This is a risky choice that some viewers will find tedious and others will find immersive. The film bets on the latter response, trusting that Hammer's performance can sustain interest through long stretches of near silence. Armie Hammer's performance deserves extended analysis, as it is universally acknowledged as the film's strongest element. Working with severe physical constraints, he cannot move his lower body for most of the film. Hammer must convey a complete emotional and psychological journey using only his face, voice, and upper body. He manages this with remarkable nuance, charting Mike's deterioration through subtle shifts in posture, expression, and vocal quality. The physical demands of the role cannot be overstated. Hammer spent much of the production standing in place under hot lights, exposed to the elements, his foot pressed to a fixed point. This is method acting not as affectation but as genuine endurance, and it shows in the authenticity of his exhaustion and pain. The performance is not showy or theatrical but grounded, believable, a study in the small defeats and recoveries that constitute survival. The film's sound design becomes increasingly important as Mike's sensory deprivation intensifies. The desert wind, the distant howl of dogs, the hallucinatory voices of memory. These elements create an aural landscape that is both realistic and expressionistic. The sound of the mine's click, first heard as a sharp mechanical report, returns throughout the film as an auditory hallucination, a trauma echo that Mike cannot escape. Andrea Bonini's score is used with restraint, never overwhelming the sparse desert soundscape, but punctuating moments of particular intensity. The music swells at key emotional beats, the death of Tommy, the moments of greatest despair, the final decision, but mostly remains in the background, allowing the natural sounds of the environment and the rhythms of Mike's breathing to carry the sonic weight of the film. The cinematography by Sergi Vilanova-Claudin transforms the desert location of Fuerteventura in the Canary Islands into a landscape that is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The widescreen compositions emphasize horizontal expanse, the flat horizon line dividing Earth from sky with geometric precision. Mike becomes a vertical interruption in this horizontal world, a standing figure in a landscape that wants everything flattened and erased. The color palette shifts subtly over the course of the film, moving from the warm golds and browns of the opening sequences to increasingly bleached, overexposed tones as Mike's dehydration and sun exposure intensify. This visual progression mirrors his psychological state, the world literally fading and whitening as his grip on reality loosens. By the 50-hour mark, the image is almost spectral, like a ghost haunting his own body. The editing by Matteo Santi, Fabio Guaglione, and Filippo Maroboni employs abundant match cuts and associative editing that some critics found heavy-handed. A shot of Mike's sweating face cuts to a childhood memory of water. His kneeling posture cuts to the proposal. His screams cut to his father's rage. These connections are not subtle, but they serve a film that is fundamentally allegorical rather than naturalistic. The editing is working to make abstract psychological connections visible and visceral. The film's treatment of its North African setting has been the subject of significant criticism, and these critiques deserve serious consideration. The unnamed country where the action takes place functions primarily as a backdrop, a hostile environment without specific political or cultural reality. The real-world tragedy of landmines, which continue to kill and maim civilians in dozens of countries, is appropriated as a metaphor for an American soldier's personal growth. The Berber character, while providing crucial philosophical perspective, also raises questions of representation. He exists primarily to serve Mike's narrative, appearing when needed to offer wisdom and disappearing when the drama requires Mike to face his ordeal alone. His own story, the loss of his daughter, his leg, his life before and after these tragedies, is gestured at but never fully explored. He is a supporting character in someone else's drama, a critique that extends to the film's entire treatment of its setting. Derek Smith of Slant magazine articulated this criticism most sharply, arguing that the film cheaply uses that backdrop as a means to melodramatize the strife of an attractive white man whose banal domestic issues are presented as paramount to the horrifying problems that continue to ravage the very environment in which he's stuck. This is a harsh but not unfair reading. The film's focus is relentlessly on Mike's internal journey, and the world outside that journey exists only as obstacle or symbol. The comparison to superior survival films is instructive. Danny Boyle's 127 Hours succeeds because Aaron Ralston's predicament is entirely real, his solution, self-amputation, an act of desperate agency that reveals character through action. Rodrigo Cortez's Buried succeeds because its claustrophobic coffin setting creates genuine formal innovation, and its critique of corporate and governmental indifference is sharp and specific. J.C. Shander's All Is Lost succeeds because Robert Redford's character is defined entirely through his resourcefulness, and the film trusts the audience to understand him without flashbacks or exposition. Mine, by contrast, lacks the procedural rigor of these films. Mike cannot act. He can only wait and endure. This passivity is thematically intentional. The film is about paralysis, after all, but it creates a dramatic vacuum that the psychological material must fill. Whether that material succeeds is the central question of the film's reception, and the critical consensus suggests it does not, at least not consistently. The flashback structure, in particular, has been criticized as cliched and reductive. The revelation that Mike's problems stem from an abusive father and commitment issues feels like screenwriting 101, a psychological backstory that explains everything and illuminates nothing. The connection between childhood trauma and adult behavior is real, certainly, but the film's treatment of this connection lacks nuance or surprise. We know from the first flashback exactly where this is going. The film's thematic ambition is admirable even when its execution falls short. The central metaphor, fear as a prison, the threat we perceive often an illusion created by our own minds, is genuinely resonant. Many people live their lives standing on metaphorical landmines, frozen by anxieties that may have no basis in reality, unable to take the step that could lead to freedom. This is a message worth exploring through cinema. The problem is that the film is so eager to be a metaphor that it forgets to be a story first. The characters beyond Mike are sketches rather than fully realized individuals. Tommy exists to die and provide motivation. Jenny exists to be proposed to or not. The Berber exists to dispense wisdom. Mike's father exists to be a monster. None of them have independent existence beyond their function in Mike's psychological journey. The film's relationship to military culture and the politics of American interventionism is notably evasive. Mike and Tommy are Marines on a mission in a foreign country, but the mission's purpose, legality, and consequences are never examined. The film wants the dramatic stakes of war, the snipers, the mines, the extraction protocols, without engaging with war's moral and political dimensions. This evasion contributes to the sense that the setting is merely costume. The factual inaccuracy regarding landmine mechanics is worth noting, though the directors have acknowledged it and framed the film as metaphorical rather than documentary. Real pressure-activated mines detonate upon initial pressure, not upon release. The foot on a mine scenario is largely a cinematic invention, appearing in films from The English Patient to No Time to Die. Mine borrows this convention knowingly, prioritizing psychological truth over technical accuracy. The film's second act is its strongest stretch, precisely because it commits most fully to the survival scenario. The sandstorm, the dogs, the radio loss, the slow dehydration. These challenges are concrete and visceral, providing immediate dramatic stakes that don't depend on psychological backstory. In these sequences, the film achieves the tense, stripped-down power it aspires to throughout. The third act's pivot to revelation is the film's riskiest move, and its success depends entirely on the viewer's investment in the metaphorical dimension. After 52 hours of agony, Mike finally musters the courage to lift his foot, accepting that he may die but refusing to remain frozen any longer. The step he takes is toward death or toward life. He cannot know which, but he takes it anyway. The discovery that the mine is actually a rusted tin can containing a toy soldier is the film's climactic twist, and it has divided audiences sharply. For some, it's a powerful revelation that validates the film's message about fear being an illusion. For others, it's a cheat, a narrative trick that retroactively undermines the tension of the preceding 2 hours. Both readings have merit, and the film does not adjudicate between them. The toy soldier in the tin can function as the film's final symbol, condensing its themes into a single image. The soldier represents childhood, military service, the games men play with violence, the diminishment of human life to plaything status. The tin can represent the rusted, discarded detritus of conflict, the ordinariness of the threat that held Mike paralyzed. The combination is both absurd and profound, a punchline that is also a thesis statement. The literal interpretation of the ending is straightforward. Mike was never in danger, his fear was entirely unfounded, and his ordeal was a product of his own mind's catastrophic misinterpretation of sensory data. This reading emphasizes the film's message about the illusory nature of fear. The prison was always unlocked, the guard was always asleep, the mine was always just trash. The psychological interpretation is more complex. Regardless of whether the object was a real mine, Mike's belief that it was created real psychological and physiological consequences. The fear, the hallucinations, the confrontation with childhood trauma. These were genuine experiences with genuine effects. The ending does not invalidate the journey. It reframes it as an internal rather than external ordeal. The bleak interpretation sees the ending as cruel irony. Mike survived by pure luck, not courage or skill. If the object had been a real mine, his decision to step off would have killed him. The Berbers' just take the step advice, if followed earlier, would have been fatal. The film's message becomes not overcome your fear, but you might get lucky, which is hardly inspirational. The thematic reading that reconciles these interpretations focuses on the nature of the step itself. Even if Mike had died, the film suggests stepping forward would have been preferable to remaining frozen indefinitely. Death, in this framework, is not the worst outcome. A life unlived, paralyzed by fear, is the true tragedy. This reading gives the ending a kind of existential courage, regardless of the mind's reality. The film's final moments, with Mike staggering across the desert toward a rescue helicopter, are deliberately ambiguous. He has survived, but what has he learned? Has he overcome his fear of commitment? Will he propose to Jenny? Will he confront his father's legacy? The film does not answer these questions, ending instead on the image of Mike walking, finally moving forward toward an uncertain future. The critical consensus on Metacritic, where the film holds a score of 40 out of 100, reflects this fundamental division. 20% of reviews were positive, 50% mixed, and 30% negative. This distribution suggests a film that is competent enough to avoid outright dismissal, but flawed enough to prevent enthusiastic endorsement. It is the definition of a mixed achievement. The Hollywood Reporter's review captures this ambivalence well, praising Hammer's performance while noting that the film threatens to come apart under its own pretensions. The phrase is apt. The film's pretensions are its greatest liability, the sense that it believes itself to be saying something more profound than it actually delivers. Pretension in art is not ambition but the gap between ambition and achievement, and mine has that gap in abundance. The Washington Post's assessment that the film ends with a grim, half-hearted joke it does not earn speaks to the ending's failure to satisfy dramatically. A twist ending must feel inevitable in retrospect, the only possible conclusion to the story that has been told. The Tin Can revelation, for many viewers, feels arbitrary rather than earned, a deus ex machina that resolves the plot without resolving the drama. The direction by Fabio Guaglione and Fabio Resinaro shows clear influences from European art cinema, particularly in the use of landscape and the willingness to embrace ambiguity and allegory. The Fabio and Fabio film credit suggests a directorial partnership that values collaborative vision, and there are moments of genuine visual poetry throughout. The problem is not a lack of talent, but a lack of discipline, an inability to trust the audience to understand the metaphor without having it explained. The cinematography, as noted, is excellent. Sergei Villanova-Claudin understands the desert as a visual subject, capturing its harsh beauty without romanticizing it. The widescreen compositions recall the great desert epics while remaining intimate enough to sustain a character's study. The use of natural light gives the film an authenticity that the script sometimes undermines. The editing has been the subject of much critical discussion, and it's worth examining the match cuts more closely. The technique, which links two shots through visual similarity, is used here to connect present and past, reality and hallucination, external ordeal and internal landscape. When it works, it creates a fluid psychological space where memory and experience interpenetrate. When it doesn't, it feels like a film studies exercise, clever rather than meaningful. The sound design, particularly in the opening sequence, has been noted as a bit imbalanced. The mix occasionally prioritizes atmosphere over clarity, making dialogue difficult to discern. This may be intentional, the disorientation of combat, the confusion of the mission, but it can also be frustrating for viewers trying to follow the narrative setup that will anchor the rest of the film. The film's relationship to the survival genre is complex. It borrows the high-concept premise, one person, one location, one problem, that has generated films from Castaway to Gravity, but it lacks the procedural satisfaction of watching a character solve problems through ingenuity. Mike cannot build shelter, find water, or signal for rescue. He can only stand and wait and suffer. This is a legitimate artistic choice, but it limits the film's appeal to audiences expecting the pleasures of the survival genre. The psychological drama that replaces survival procedural is, as discussed, uneven. The childhood flashbacks are the weakest element, relying on familiar tropes of the abusive father and the traumatized child who becomes a damaged adult. These scenes feel like they belong to a different, less interesting film, one that explains rather than explores, that diagnoses rather than dramatizes. The relationship material with Jenny is slightly stronger, if only because Annabelle Wallis brings warmth and specificity to an underwritten role. The scenes of their relationship, glimpsed in fragments, suggest a genuine connection that Mike's fear prevents him from fully embracing. The The proposal that hangs over the film is a real dramatic question, and its resolution, or lack thereof, matters to the audience. The Berber, as noted, is both the film's most interesting character and its most problematic. Clint Dyer's performance is excellent, bringing gravitas and mystery to a role that could easily be merely functional. But the character's function in the narrative, to be the wise other who helps the white protagonist find himself, is a well-worn trope that the film does nothing to complicate or subvert. The film's treatment of landmines as metaphor deserves further scrutiny. Landmines are not metaphors for the people who live with them. They are a brutal reality that kills and maims thousands every year, mostly civilians, mostly in the global South. To use them as a symbol for an American soldier's fear of commitment is, at best, tone-deaf and at worst, a form of narrative imperialism that appropriates real suffering for the sake of a less significant story. The director's framing of the film as an instructive movie made by borrowing myths and rumors about landmines suggests an awareness of their departure from realism. But this framing also reveals the film's fundamentally metaphorical approach. The mine is not a real mine, the desert is not a real country, the war is not a real war. Everything is symbol, and the symbols point inward toward the protagonist's psyche rather than outward toward the world. This inward focus is not inherently invalid. Many great films are allegorical, using external events to explore internal states. The problem with Mine is that its allegory feels small in comparison to the reality it borrows. The Berber's loss of his daughter to a real mine, mentioned in passing, is a tragedy of far greater magnitude than Mike's inability to propose to his girlfriend. The film acknowledges this disparity but does not know how to handle it, so it returns its focus to Mike. The 52-hour timeline is an arbitrary constraint that the film uses effectively. The countdown creates urgency, marking the passage of time through the changing light and Mike's deteriorating condition. But the timeline also raises questions the film does not answer. Why 52 hours? What happens after that? If rescue could come at hour 53, why not earlier? The specificity is dramatic rather than logical. The film's climax, Mike's decision to step off the mine, is the moment toward which everything has been building. Hammer plays it with a calm that contrasts with his earlier panic, a serenity that suggests genuine acceptance of whatever comes next. The step itself is filmed in slow motion, the boot lifting the mechanism, or tin can, beneath the weight shifting, and then nothing. No explosión. The anticlimax is the point. The aftermath of the revelation is handled quickly, perhaps too quickly. Mike's reaction, relief, disbelief, the beginning of emotional processing, is compressed into moments before the rescue helicopter arrives. The film seems eager to end, to release both Mike and the audience from the ordeal. A longer denouement might have allowed the emotional implications to land more fully. The final shot of Mike walking toward the helicopter, his back to the camera, the desert stretching behind him, is a classic closing image. It signifies movement after stasis, future after paralysis, life after the long confrontation with death. Whether this image feels earned depends on the viewer's engagement with everything that preceded it. Mine is a film about fear that is itself afraid to trust its premise, afraid to trust its audience, afraid to be merely a survival thriller when it could be a psychological allegory. This fear leads it to overexplain, to clutter its clean premise with backstory and symbol and explanation. The film that might have been a lean existential survival drama about a man alone with a mine and his thoughts is visible beneath the film that actually exists. The performances are the film's redemption. Armie Hammer carries the picture with a commitment that transcends the material's limitations. Clint Dyer provides depth and presence in a role that could have been thankless. Even the supporting performances in the flashback sequences, Jeff Bell's brutal father, Annabelle Wallis's conflicted girlfriend, serve the film well within their limited screen time. The technical craft on display suggests directors with real facility who might, with different material, produce something exceptional. The visual sense is strong, the control of tone is evident in individual sequences, and the ambition is genuine. What's missing is the judgment to recognize when a script needs another draft, when a metaphor is becoming overworked, when explanation is undermining mystery. The film's legacy will likely be as a curious artifact, a high-concept thriller that aimed for profundity and achieved intermittent effectiveness. It will be remembered for Hammer's performance and for its central metaphor, even as its execution flaws prevent it from joining the canon of great survival films. It is a film that, like its protagonist, stands frozen between what it is and what it might have been, never quite finding the courage to become either. The experience of watching Mine is ultimately one of frustration mixed with intermittent admiration. The frustration comes from seeing a strong premise undermined by overreach. The admiration comes from the moments when the film commits fully to its scenario and achieves genuine tension and pathos. These moments are real, and they demonstrate what the film might have been with more discipline and less pretension. The film's place in the careers of its creators remains to be seen. Fabio Guaglione and Fabio Rezanaro have not directed another feature since Mine, which may indicate the difficulty of launching a career from a mixed reception. Armie Hammer's subsequent career has been complicated by personal controversies, adding a layer of unintended resonance to a film about a man trapped by his own actions and unable to move forward. Mine is, finally, a film about the stories we tell ourselves. The stories that keep us frozen, the stories that set us free, the stories that turn out to be tin cans rather than mines. It is a film that wants to tell a story about the courage to step forward, and in its best moments, it succeeds. In its lesser moments, it demonstrates the difficulty of that step, the way fear of failure can produce the failure it fears. The film's reach exceeds its grasp, but the reach itself is worth acknowledging, a gesture toward meaning that, while incomplete, is not entirely empty. The psychological architecture of Mike Stevens is built upon a foundation of repressed memory, and the film excavates this foundation with the gradual precision of an archaeological dig rather than the hurried impatience of a therapy session. Each flashback functions as a stratum of consciousness, revealing not just what happened to the child Mike, but how those experiences calcified into the behavioral patterns that define the adult soldier. The abusive father is not merely a villain, but a formative presence whose violence taught Mike that love is dangerous, that vulnerability invites attack, that standing still and making no sudden moves is the safest strategy for survival. This childhood lesson, learned in the cramped interiors of a working-class home, translates with terrible efficiency to the minefield, where standing still becomes both survival tactic and existential prison. The film's sonic environment deserves deeper exploration than it typically receives in critical discussion, particularly the way silence functions as an active presence rather than a mere absence of sound. The desert is not quiet in the way a library is quiet. It is silent in the way a held breath is silent, charged with potential energy, waiting to be broken by the next gust of wind or distant explosion or hallucinated voice. Andrea Bonini's score emerges from this silence like condensation on cold glass, gradual and almost imperceptible until it has saturated the emotional atmosphere completely. The composer understands that in a film about stasis, music cannot propel action, but must instead deepen contemplation. The relationship between Mike's body and the landscape that imprisons it constitutes a visual essay on scale and vulnerability that the directors develop with painterly attention to composition. In the wide shots, Mike is a vertical line in a horizontal world, a standing figure that defies the desert's preference for flatness and erosion. In the tight shots, his face becomes a landscape itself, mapped with the topography of sunburn and dehydration, the geological strata of exhaustion visible in the lines around his eyes and the cracking of his lips. Cinematographer Sergei Villanova-Claudin moves between these two registers with an instinct for when intimacy becomes claustrophobic and when distance becomes alienating. The cultural politics of the film's setting demand more rigorous interrogation than a simple acknowledgement of insensitivity, because the problem is structural rather than incidental and speaks to broader patterns in Western cinema's treatment of the global South. The unnamed North African country exists in a peculiar narrative limbo, specific enough to feel real. The wedding convoy, the desert terrain, the Arabic signage, but vague enough to avoid any actual geopolitical engagement with the histories of colonialism, resource extraction, and military intervention that have left millions of landmines scattered across the region. The mines themselves are treated as natural features of the landscape rather than as the residue of political decisions made by powerful nations, including potentially the one Mike serves. The Berber character crystallizes these representational tensions in ways that reward sustained critical attention, because he is simultaneously the film's wisest character and its most reductive stereotype. His function as spiritual guide to a stranded white protagonist places him in a lineage that stretches from Jim in Lord Jim to the various indigenous mentors who populate survival narratives, always possessing the local knowledge the protagonist lacks, but never possessing the interiority that would make them fully human in the narrative's terms. When the Berber speaks of his daughter's death, the film grants the moment weight but not space, quickly returning to Mike's less consequential but more narratively privileged suffering. The hallucination sequences employ a visual grammar distinct from the rest of the film, and this stylistic differentiation reveals the director's understanding that psychological reality requires different treatment than physical reality. The flashbacks are lit with warmer, more saturated colors, the interiors suffused with the amber glow of memory and nostalgia, even when the events depicted are traumatic. The childhood home appears almost as a stage set, slightly too vivid to be naturalistic, because memory does not record spaces photographically, but reconstructs them through the distorting lens of emotion. The abusive father looms larger than a real person would, his physical presence augmented by the child's terrified perception. The film's relationship to military culture is more ambivalent than its surface might suggest, containing moments of implicit critique that complicate any reading of it as straightforward valorization of soldierly endurance. Mike's training has prepared him for combat but not for survival, for action but not for patience, for killing but not for dying. The military apparatus that put him in the desert proves unable to extract him. The technology that was supposed to guarantee his safety fails catastrophically, and the chain of command that gives his life structure offers nothing but a countdown and a prayer. These elements accumulate into a portrait of institutional abandonment that the film never makes explicit, but that attentive viewing cannot ignore. The Tin Can revelation deserves to be understood not merely as a twist ending, but as the culmination of a symbolic pattern that the film has been weaving from its opening frames, though perhaps not with the clarity that would make the pattern legible on first viewing. The toy soldier that Mike finds inside the rusted container is the final appearance of a motif that has surfaced repeatedly in his hallucinations. A plastic figure that represents both the childhood he lost to violence and the adulthood he sought through military service. That this figure has been waiting beneath his foot for 52 hours, that he has been standing on his own symbol without knowing it, gives the revelation a psychological density that the mechanics of the plot twist can only gesture toward. The duration of Mike's ordeal is precisely calibrated to test the limits of both character and audience, and the film's willingness to dwell in discomfort rather than rush toward resolution distinguishes it from more conventionally paced thrillers. 52 hours is long enough to feel like an eternity without becoming literally impossible, and the film tracks this passage through objective markers. The movement of the sun, the changing quality of light, the visible deterioration of Mike's physical condition, rather than through the artificial urgency of a ticking clock. Time becomes a substance rather than a measure, something that must be endured rather than counted. The dogs that attack Mike during the night sequences function on multiple symbolic levels simultaneously, embodying both the literal dangers of the desert and the psychological demons that emerge when darkness and isolation strip away the defenses of civilization. They are real animals, rendered with practical effects and sound design that makes their snarling presence viscerally immediate, but they are also projections of Mike's fear, his childhood terror of his father's unpredictable violence given animal form. The sequence where he must fight them off while keeping his foot absolutely still is the film's most successful fusion of physical and psychological danger. The relationship between Mike and Tommy, though brief in screen time, establishes the emotional stakes that will sustain the remainder of the film, and the performances by Hammer and Tom Cullen invest this friendship with a lived-in quality that backstory alone could not provide. Their banter before the mission goes wrong reveals the intimacy of men who have depended on each other in life-threatening situations, the easy shorthand and dark humor that soldiers develop as armor against fear. Tommy's death is devastating not because we know him well, but because Mike's reaction tells us everything about what he meant, and Hammer's performance in the aftermath communicates grief with an economy that the film's more elaborate emotional sequences sometimes lack. The film's treatment of the proposal that Mike cannot bring himself to make is more nuanced than the commitment issues shorthand suggests, because the hesitation is not simply about fear of marriage, but about a deeper question of worthiness that the childhood flashbacks illuminate. Mike's father taught him that he was fundamentally unworthy of love, that any affection offered would inevitably be withdrawn or corrupted into violence. To propose to Jenny would be to claim worthiness, to assert that he deserves happiness, to challenge the fundamental premise of his childhood conditioning. The mind becomes the external obstacle that allows him to avoid this internal confrontation. The sandstorm sequence represents the film's most ambitious technical achievement and its most effective integration of practical and visual effects to create a coherent sensory experience. The storm is not merely a weather event, but an ontological crisis, a moment when the distinction between self and world, reality and hallucination, past and present dissolves into a howling chaos of wind and sand. Mike's body becomes the only fixed point in a universe that has lost all stability, and the sequence's power derives from the way it makes the audience feel this disorientation rather than simply observe it. When the storm passes and the radio is gone, the new silence carries the weight of absolute isolation. The concept of luck that the Berber introduces deserves philosophical unpacking, because it represents a worldview fundamentally at odds with the American individualism that Mike embodies. For the Berber, luck is not about individual fortune but about cosmic perspective, the recognition that any suffering can be measured against greater suffering and found, if not bearable, at least survivable. Mike initially rejects this framing as cruel, but the film gradually reveals it as compassionate in a way that his own self-pity cannot be. The Berber has lost more than Mike and complains less, not because he feels less, but because he has integrated loss into his understanding of life rather than treating it as an exception. The visual motif of kneeling recurs throughout the film with an insistence that rewards close attention, because each instance of kneeling carries different emotional valences that the editing deliberately conflates. Kneeling before the father in terror, kneeling before Jenny in supplication, kneeling on the mine in paralysis. These are distinct postures that the film's associative editing treats as versions of the same posture, the same relationship to power and vulnerability. The proposal kneel is particularly charged because it combines voluntary submission with hopeful anticipation, a combination that Mike's history makes almost impossible to sustain. The film's engagement with the conventions of the survival genre is knowing without being deconstructive, borrowing elements from predecessors while adapting them to its specific thematic concerns. The countdown structure recalls High Noon and its many descendants, but where those films build toward a confrontation, mine builds toward a revelation. The isolated protagonist echoes Cast Away, but where Chuck Nolan talks to a volleyball, Mike talks to a ghost. The self-surgery scene in 127 Hours becomes, in mine, the decision to step off the mine, an action that requires equal courage but involves no agency, only surrender. The performances in the flashback sequences deserve more attention than they typically receive, because the film's emotional architecture depends on these scenes landing with sufficient force to justify the psychological weight placed upon them. Jeff Bell's portrayal of the abusive father is particularly effective in its refusal to soften the character with redeeming qualities or understandable motivations. This is not a complex villain but a simple monster, and the simplicity is the point. For the child Mike, there was no nuance to his terror, no mitigating context that might make the beatings comprehensible. Bell's performance honors this perspective by making the father opaque, unknowable, purely threatening. The film's color grading shifts perceptibly as Mike's ordeal progresses, moving from the warm earth tones of the opening sequences through increasingly desaturated and overexposed registers as dehydration and sun exposure take their toll. By the final hours before rescue, the image has become almost monochromatic, the golden sand and blue sky bleached toward white, as if the world itself is fading along with Mike's consciousness. This technical choice is subtle enough that many viewers will register its effect without consciously noticing its mechanism, which is precisely the kind of invisible craft that supports emotional response without calling attention to itself. The geography of the minefield deserves attention as a constructed space that the film maps through Mike's limited and terrified perception. We learn its boundaries through what he can see and what the Berber tells him, but the exact dimensions remain vague, contributing to the sense of infinite threat. The mine that holds Mike is not a single point of danger, but the representative of a field of identical points, a grid of potential death that extends in all directions. This spatial uncertainty mirrors the temporal uncertainty of the 52-hour countdown, creating a coordinate system of anxiety with no stable reference points. The relationship between sound and image in the film's most intense sequences operates according to a logic of counterpoint rather than synchronization, with the score often providing emotional continuity, while the sound design delivers the shocks and silences that keep the audience off balance. The click of the mine mechanism, first heard as a sharp report and later returning as auditory hallucination, becomes a sound motif that organizes the film's sonic vocabulary around the axis of threat and release. Each recurrence of the click tightens the tension, even as the audience learns that the sound's meaning is unstable, that what it signifies may not be what Mike believes it signifies. The film's ending has been read primarily in terms of its twist mechanics, but a fuller reading considers the tonal shift that accompanies the revelation, a shift from existential dread to something approaching absurdist comedy. The toy soldier in the tin can is not just a symbol but a punchline, and the film's willingness to end on what the Washington Post called a grim, half-hearted joke suggests generic ambitions beyond the survival thriller. The absurdist reading connects mind to a tradition that includes Beckett and Kafka, where the universe's indifference to human suffering manifests not as tragedy, but as dark comedy. The directorial partnership of Guaglione and Resinaro raises questions about collaborative authorship that the film itself does not answer, but that criticism should at least acknowledge. The Fabio and Fabio film credit suggests a merged artistic identity, a deliberate blurring of individual contribution in favor of collective vision. Whether this partnership produces work greater than either could achieve alone is a question for their future projects to answer. In mine, the collaboration yields a film of clear ambition and uneven execution that feels like the product of two sensibilities not always in perfect alignment. The film's place in the broader landscape of 2010's survival cinema reveals both its debts and its attempted innovations. The decade saw a resurgence of the single-location survival film, driven partly by budgetary constraints and partly by audience appetite for intense, contained experiences. Mine enters this field with a premise as high concept as any, a man on a mine for 52 hours, but makes choices that push against genre expectations, particularly in its turn towards psychological allegory and its refusal of the procedural satisfactions that define films like The Martian or All Is Lost. The hallucination of the toy soldiers deserves specific analysis as a recurring image that accumulates meaning through repetition and variation. They first appear as childhood toys in Mike's flashbacks, innocent objects associated with play and imagination. Their return in the desert hallucinations transforms them into something more sinister, miniature versions of the soldiers that Mike and Tommy were when the mission began. The toy soldier in the tin can at the film's climax unites these associations, suggesting that Mike has been playing at war his entire life, that the military was an extension of childhood fantasy, that the mine was always a game whose stakes he misunderstood. The film's treatment of physical pain is unflinching without becoming exploitative, charting Mike's deterioration through specific, concrete details rather than generalized suffering. The sunburn that blisters his neck, the thirst that cracks his lips and swells his tongue, the muscle fatigue that makes his legs tremble with the effort of remaining still. These are rendered with a clinical precision that honors the reality of the body under duress. Hammer's performance is crucial here, because he must make each new stage of deterioration legible without overplaying, must show the accumulation of damage without losing the character's fundamental coherence. The Berber's wooden leg becomes a visual argument that the film makes without ever stating explicitly that loss can be survived, that amputation is not annihilation, that the body can be broken and the person can continue. This argument is directed at Mike, who fears that any step forward will destroy him, but it is also directed at the audience, who may share his assumption that catastrophe is final. The Berber's mobility, his calm, his continued existence in the landscape that took his leg and his daughter, constitutes the film's most hopeful counter-argument to Mike's paralysis, and it is delivered entirely through performance and image rather than dialogue. The film's production history, shot in the Canary Islands rather than North Africa, reflects practical and economic constraints that shape the final product in ways both visible and invisible. The Fuerteventura landscapes are convincing as desert terrain, but the absence of any specific cultural markers or local populations beyond the Berber creates a sense of emptiness that serves the film thematically while potentially misrepresenting the region cinematically. The desert becomes a blank canvas for psychological projection precisely because it has been emptied of its actual inhabitants and their actual lives. The sequence where Mike attempts to reach his fallen radio after the sandstorm illustrates the film's skill at generating tension from minimal movement. He cannot lift his foot, but he can stretch, can extend his body horizontally while keeping one leg vertical, can strain toward communication with every muscle while remaining fundamentally rooted in place. The sequence is a study in the body's geometry, the angles of reach and limitation, the physics of a man trying to solve a problem with 2/3 of his available mobility. It is also a study in hope, because the radio represents rescue, human contact, the end of isolation, and its loss is correspondingly devastating. The theme of fatherhood runs through the film in ways that connect Mike's personal history to larger questions about authority, violence, and the transmission of trauma across generations. Mike's father abused him. Mike becomes a soldier, trained in violence. Mike hesitates to propose to Jenny, perhaps because he fears becoming a father himself and perpetuating the cycle. The toy soldier in the tin can, when it appears, suggest that these connections are not merely thematic but structural, that the child's game and the adult's profession are versions of the same activity, that the mine is the logical endpoint of a life organized around violence. The film's use of match cuts has been criticized as heavy-handed, but a more generous reading understands them as an attempt to create a visual language appropriate to the psychological state being depicted. When consciousness is fragmenting, when past and present are bleeding into each other, when the boundaries of the self are dissolving, conventional continuity editing would misrepresent the experience. The match cuts are not transitions between scenes but collapses of distinction, formal equivalents of the psychological merging that trauma produces. Whether they succeed is a matter of taste, but their intention is more sophisticated than the criticism acknowledges. The final image of Mike walking toward the rescue helicopter carries a weight that depends entirely on the audience's journey through the preceding narrative. If we have invested in his ordeal, the image is cathartic. Movement after stasis, rescue after abandonment, life after the long confrontation with death. If we have resisted the film's emotional manipulations, the image may feel unearned. A happy ending appended to a story that, in its darker implications, suggested no such resolution was possible. The film does not adjudicate between these responses, ending on the image itself and leaving interpretation to the viewer. The opening sequence's sound mixing, which some critics noted as imbalanced, actually performs a subtle cognitive function by placing the audience inside Mike's perceptual field, where mission-critical audio competes with the rushing of blood in his ears, the dry rasp of his own breathing, and the metallic clicks of weaponry being prepared for lethal purpose. This subjective soundscape refuses the clarity of omniscience, forcing viewers to strain for information, just as the soldiers strain to interpret the ambiguous movements of the wedding convoy through their scopes. The imbalance is therefore not a technical flaw but a formal strategy, an oral equivalent of the shallow depth of field that keeps the target in focus while blurring the moral context of the assassination. The film's treatment of military hierarchy deserves scrutiny as a system that promises structure but delivers only deferred responsibility, with the commanding officer's voice emanating from the radio as a disembodied authority that can issue orders and timelines but cannot provide actual assistance. This voice, calm and procedural even as Mike's situation deteriorates, represents the institutional distance between those who make decisions and those who suffer their consequences. The broken GPS that prevents Mike from communicating his coordinates becomes a potent symbol of this rupture. The technological interface that should connect soldier to system failing at the crucial moment, leaving only the simulacrum of support without its substance. The theological dimensions of mine remain largely unexplored in critical discourse. Yet the film repeatedly invokes the language and imagery of religious trial through its desert setting, its countdown structure suggesting Lenten endurance, and its protagonist's name, Stevens, echoing the first Christian martyr stoned outside the city walls. Mike's ordeal follows the classic pattern of the dark night of the soul, a period of radical desolation in which all consolations are stripped away and only the naked self remains to confront its own insufficiency. The Berber functions as a kind of desert father, a figure from early Christian monasticism who has withdrawn from the world and gained wisdom through suffering. The mine itself, considered as a theological object, operates like an inverted sacrament, an outward sign of an inward grace that has been corrupted into an outward sign of inward terror. Sacraments mediate between visible and invisible reality, making spiritual truths materially present. The mine mediates between Mike's conscious mind and his buried trauma, making psychological paralysis physically present. The click that freezes him is the anti-Eucharistic moment, the sound that transubstantiates ordinary desert earth into a zone of potential annihilation, and his 52-hour vigil becomes a perverted adoration before an altar that promises not salvation but destruction. The relationship between Mike and his spotter Tommy, though brief, establishes a model of masculine intimacy that the rest of the film will mourn and cannot replace. Their partnership is built on the extraordinary trust required when one man's life depends on another's eyes. When the spotter calculates wind and distance and trajectory, while the sniper becomes the instrument of their combined judgment. This interdependence is the closest Mike has come to functional intimacy, and its violent termination leaves him not only alone but relationally amputated, missing the person who made his professional identity coherent and his emotional isolation bearable. The decision to have Tommy take his own life rather than die slowly from his injuries is a narrative choice with significant ethical weight, raising questions about military training, masculine codes of stoicism, and the calculus of suffering that the film acknowledges without resolving. Tommy's suicide is presented neither as cowardice nor as heroism, but as a fact, a thing that happens in this situation, and the film's refusal to moralize about it respects the audience's capacity to sit with ambiguity. Mike's response, horror, grief, but also a terrible understanding, suggests that the bond between these men was deep enough to comprehend even this final, irreversible choice. The Berber's wooden leg, examined more closely, functions as what anthropologists call a boundary object, an artifact that mediates between different worlds of experience and enables communication across the gap that separates Mike's privileged American life from the Berber's war-ravaged existence. The leg is simultaneously a medical device, a war wound, an adaptive technology, and a philosophical text written in scar tissue and carved wood. When the Berber walks on it, he demonstrates that survival is not about remaining intact, but about finding new ways to move through a world that has already taken its pound of flesh. The childhood sequences set in Mike's family home employ a visual claustrophobia that contrasts deliberately with the desert's agoraphobic expanse, suggesting that trauma is spatial as well as temporal, that the rooms where violence occurred continue to exist in the psyche as prisons from which escape is impossible. The narrow hallways, the closed doors, the looming figure of the father filling the frame. These compositions create a geometry of threat that the open desert, for all its dangers, cannot replicate. Mike has exchanged one kind of confinement for another, the domestic box for the military hierarchy, and the mind merely literalizes the condition he has always inhabited. The film's engagement with the philosophy of existentialism operates beneath its thriller surface like a second narrative, one that addresses the fundamental questions of freedom, choice, and authenticity that Sartre and Camus placed at the center of 20th century thought. Mike's situation, condemned to be free even while immobilized, forced to choose his attitude toward an unchosen circumstance, exemplifies the existential condition in its purest form. He cannot control the mine, the desert, the sandstorm, or the rescue timeline. He can only control his response to these givens, and the film charts his painful progress toward an authentic encounter with his situation. The hallucinated visits from Jenny serve a dramaturgical function beyond providing romantic backstory, because they externalize the internal dialogue between Mike's desire for connection and his conviction that he does not deserve it. These sequences are filmed with a different texture than the desert reality, softer focus, warmer light, the visual language of memory and fantasy. And this differentiation keeps the audience oriented even as Mike's grip on reality loosens. Jenny's appearances become less frequent as the ordeal intensifies, suggesting that even his capacity to imagine comfort is being stripped away, leaving only the bare self and its resources. The film's approach to race and representation becomes more troubling the more closely it is examined, because the Berber's function as spiritual guide to a white protagonist is not incidental to the narrative but constitutive of it. Without the Berber, Mike would have no access to the wisdom that ultimately enables his survival. The film thus depends on a character it refuses to make central, extracting what it needs from his experience while denying him the narrative attention it lavishes on its protagonist. This extraction economy mirrors, at the level of storytelling, the resource extraction that has characterized Western engagement with North Africa for centuries, and the film shows no awareness of this mirroring. The technical accuracy of the mine mechanics, while acknowledged as secondary to the film's metaphorical ambitions, nonetheless shapes the audience's engagement with the central premise in ways that the directors may not have fully considered. Viewers who know that pressure-activated mines detonate on initial contact rather than on release may find the entire scenario implausible, their suspension of disbelief broken before the story has properly begun. The film's gamble is that emotional truth will override technical truth, that the metaphor will hold even if the mechanics don't. For some viewers, this gamble pays off. For others, it constitutes a fatal crack in the narrative foundation. The film's editing rhythm shifts perceptibly across its 3 acts, with the opening mission sequence cut at a pace appropriate to the thriller genre, the middle ordeal section settling into a more contemplative tempo that allows time to feel heavy and slow, and the climactic revelation sequence accelerating again toward its conclusion. This tripartite structure maps onto classical dramatic theory: exposition, complication, resolution, but does so in a way that foregrounds temporal experience rather than plot mechanics. The middle section, in which almost nothing happens externally, is the film's boldest formal gesture, a commitment to duration that risks audience patience in pursuit of immersive identification. The desert's acoustic properties become an uncredited character in the film's soundscape, with the dry air absorbing certain frequencies while carrying others across impossible distances. The distant barking of the feral dogs arrives as if from nowhere, directionless and omnipresent, while the close sounds of Mike's own body, his breathing, his heartbeat, the scrape of fabric against sunburned skin, are rendered with hyperreal clarity. This acoustic contrast between the vast and the intimate creates a sonic equivalent of the film's central thematic tension between cosmic indifference and individual suffering. The toy soldier motif accumulates additional resonance when considered in the context of military recruitment and the romanticization of combat that draws young people, particularly young men from difficult backgrounds, toward the armed services. Mike's childhood was populated by toy soldiers, by play that rehearsed adult violence without its consequences, and his enlistment represents the logical extension of this play into reality. The toy soldier in the tin can, discovered after 52 hours of genuine suffering, suggests that the game has been exposed, that the simulacrum of danger has given way to the real thing, that Mike has finally outgrown the fantasies that structured his life. The film's treatment of thirst as both physical sensation and spiritual metaphor connects mind to a long tradition of desert literature, from the Hebrew scriptures to the Desert Fathers to T. Lawrence, in which dehydration becomes the condition for revelation. Mike's increasing thirst is rendered with physiological accuracy. The cracked lips, the swollen tongue, the hallucinations that severe dehydration produces. But it also functions as a symbol of spiritual aridity, the drying up of the psychological resources on which he has depended. When he finally drinks, the water is both physical relief and symbolic renewal, a baptism that marks his transition from paralysis to movement. The relationship between landscape and psyche and mind draws on romantic and expressionist traditions that externalize internal states through environment, but it does so with a minimalist aesthetic that strips this technique to its essentials. The desert is not merely a backdrop that reflects Mike's emotional condition. It is an active agent that shapes that condition, its heat and emptiness and hostility becoming the very substance of his psychological experience. This is not the pathetic fallacy, in which nature sympathizes with human emotion, but something closer to environmental determinism, in which the setting creates the psychological conditions that the character must then navigate. The film's silences are as carefully composed as it sounds, with the directors and sound designers creating a dynamic range that moves from absolute quiet to explosive noise and back again. These silences are not empty but full, charged with the anticipation of the next sound, the next attack, the next hallucination. They create a listening attitude in the audience, a heightened sensitivity to auditory cues that mirrors Mike's own hypervigilance. When the mind clicks, whether in reality or in Mike's imagination, the sound is devastating precisely because it emerges from and returns to this pregnant silence. The performance of physical deterioration that Hammer delivers depends on a vocabulary of microgestures, small movements of the eyes and mouth and hands that accumulate over the 52-hour timeline to create a comprehensive portrait of a body under extreme duress. He cannot move his feet, so his hands become extraordinarily expressive, clutching at his rifle, wiping sweat from his brow, reaching toward the lost radio, forming fists of frustration, and then relaxing into resignation. This manual choreography provides a visual counterpoint to the static lower body, a dance of the possible within the constraints of the impossible. The Berber statement that Mike is a lucky man functions as a Zen koan, a statement that cannot be understood rationally but must be contemplated until it yields its meaning through a shift in consciousness rather than a logical deduction. From Mike's perspective, luck is the last word he would use to describe his situation, and his incomprehension of the Berbers' claim measures the distance between their worldviews. The film does not resolve this distance, but allows it to stand as a productive tension, an invitation to the audience to consider what luck might mean in a context where survival itself is the only gift that matters. The film's production design, particularly in the construction of the minefield, creates a space that is simultaneously specific and abstract. A particular patch of desert that could be any patch of desert in any of the dozens of countries where landmines remain an active threat. The warning sign that Mike and Tommy encounter before entering the field is weathered and barely legible, suggesting that it has stood for years or decades, that the danger it announces has become a permanent feature of the landscape rather than an emergency to be resolved. This permanence indicts the international community's failure to address the landmine crisis, a political subtext the film invokes without developing. The narrative's treatment of time is worth comparing to classical unities of drama, which held that a play should take place in a single location over a single day. Mine stretches this unity to 52 hours and a single patch of desert, creating an intensified version of the classical constraint that generates its dramatic power from the friction between real time and dramatic time. The audience experiences the ordeal in roughly 2 hours, while the character experiences it over 2 days, and this compression creates a density of experience that approximates, without replicating, the subjective experience of crisis in which time slows to a crawl. The film's relationship to the war film genre is vexed and interesting, because it borrows the genre's visual vocabulary and character types while refusing its narrative conventions of mission, combat, and resolution. There is no battle in Mine, no enemy to be defeated, no objective to be achieved. There is only survival, a goal that transcends military objectives and reduces the soldier to the most fundamental human condition. This reduction is both the film's greatest strength, its willingness to strip war of its narrative satisfactions, and its greatest limitation, because it leaves unexamined the political structures that put soldiers in minefields in the first place. The hallucination of Mike's father that appears during the darkest hours of the ordeal represents the return of the repressed in its most terrifying form. The abusive parent who cannot be escaped because he has been internalized, his voice becoming the inner critic that tells Mike he will fail, that he deserves to suffer, that he is fundamentally inadequate. Jeff Bell's performance in these sequences is monstrous but not caricatured, a study in the banality of domestic evil that explains without excusing the damage it causes. When Mike finally defies this internalized father, stepping off the mine despite the voice that tells him he will die, the psychological victory matters more than the physical survival it enables. The color palette of the film's final sequence, the sunrise that greets Mike after his liberation from the mine, shifts dramatically from the bleached, overexposed tones of the ordeal to a warmer, more saturated register that suggests renewal and the return of life's possibilities. This visual shift is the film's most hopeful gesture, a promise that suffering is not permanent, that the world can become beautiful again after it has been emptied of beauty. Whether this promise feels earned or imposed depends on the viewer's journey through the darkness that precedes it, and the film does not guarantee a uniform response. The director's decision to film in Fuerteventura, one of the Canary Islands, rather than in an actual North African desert, carries implications for the film's relationship to authenticity that extend beyond mere logistical convenience. The location is convincing as desert, but carries none of the specific cultural or political history of the region it represents, functioning as a generic space rather than a particular place. This generic quality serves the allegorical dimension of the film while undermining its claims to relevance regarding the actual landmine crisis, creating a tension between universalizing ambition and specific reference that the film never fully resolves. The performance style that Hammer adopts for the desert sequences differs markedly from his work in the flashback scenes, with the present tense Mike characterized by a physical stillness and vocal restraint that contrasts with the more expressive, emotionally volatile figure of the past. This differentiation creates a sense of psychological development, suggesting that military discipline has taught Mike to suppress the emotions that once overwhelmed him, but that this suppression has come at the cost of his capacity for intimacy and spontaneity. The mine ordeal forces him to reconnect with these suppressed dimensions of self, and Hammer charts this reconnection through a gradual relaxation of the rigid control that characterizes his early scenes. The film's philosophical engagement with the concept of courage deserves careful attention, because the ending redefines courage not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to act despite fear, to take the step even when the step might lead to annihilation. This is the classical definition of courage, articulated by Aristotle and refined by centuries of ethical thought, and the film's contribution is to apply it to a situation in which the feared outcome never materializes. The courage is real even though the threat was illusory, because Mike believed in the threat and acted anyway, and the film asks whether courage depends on objective danger or only on the subjective perception of danger. The Berber's narrative function extends beyond his on-screen appearances, because his perspective haunts the film even when he is absent, his words echoing in Mike's memory and in the audience's understanding of what they are watching. His claim that Mike is lucky, his advice to take the step, his example of survival despite catastrophic loss. These elements form a counter-narrative to Mike's self-pity, a perspective that the film offers but does not impose. The audience is left to navigate between Mike's experience and the Berber's wisdom, to decide which perspective carries more weight, to determine what the film is ultimately saying about suffering and survival. The final shot of the film, Mike walking toward the helicopter, his back to the camera, the desert stretching endlessly behind him, participates in a cinematic tradition of ambiguous endings that refuse to provide closure even as they provide resolution. We know Mike survives. We do not know what kind of person emerges from this survival, whether he will propose to Jenny, whether he will confront his father's legacy, whether he will remain in the military or seek a different life. The image holds these questions open, allowing them to resonate beyond the credits, making the film an experience that continues in the mind after it ends on the screen. The desert in mind functions as what phenomenologists call a limit situation, an experience that pushes human consciousness to its absolute boundaries and reveals, in the crisis of those boundaries, fundamental truths about existence that ordinary life obscures beneath layers of routine and distraction. Mike cannot check his phone, cannot distract himself with entertainment, cannot seek comfort in social interaction or professional identity or any of the other buffers that normally protect the psyche from direct confrontation with its own fragility. The desert strips all of this away, leaving only the bare self and the bare fact of mortality, and the film's power derives largely from its willingness to hold the audience in this stripped condition without offering easy escape. The sound of the mind's click deserves phenomenological analysis as what philosopher Gaston Bachelard might call a primal sonic image, a sound that condenses an entire world of meaning into a single auditory instant. The click is not merely a mechanical noise, but the annihilation of future time, the end of possibility, the transformation of an ordinary patch of desert into a boundary between life and death. Once heard, it cannot be unheard. It echoes through the remainder of the film, through Mike's consciousness, through the audience's memory, a sound that continues to signify long after its acoustic vibration has dissipated into the desert air. The film's relationship to water as both physical necessity and symbolic substance weaves through the narrative with biblical resonance, beginning with the casual hydration of the opening mission and progressing through the increasingly desperate attempts to conserve and locate moisture as the ordeal continues. Mike's water runs out, then his hope of finding more, then even the capacity to produce tears or saliva, until he is reduced to licking condensation from his equipment and hallucinating streams that do not exist. This dehydration arc maps onto the spiritual dryness of his interior life, the emotional aridity produced by decades of suppressing vulnerability, and the film suggests that both thirsts must be acknowledged before either can be quenched. The Berber's wooden leg, considered as a sculptural object rather than merely a character detail, embodies an aesthetics of repair that the film counterposes to Mike's fantasy of remaining intact. The leg is carved, shaped, fitted, a collaboration between human craft and bodily limitation that transforms loss into a new kind of wholeness. It is not the original leg and never will be, but it enables movement, enables continued participation in life, enables the Berber to walk through the same desert that took his flesh and his daughter. Mike, by contrast, remains fixated on the fantasy that he can emerge from his ordeal unchanged, and the film slowly reveals this fantasy as the true danger. The hallucination sequences employ a temporal logic distinct from the linear progression of the desert ordeal, moving associatively through Mike's memory rather than chronologically through his history. Childhood scenes intercut with military training. Jenny appears alongside the father, the toy soldiers surface in contexts both innocent and threatening. This temporal fluidity reflects the way trauma actually operates in consciousness, collapsing past into present, making every moment a potential recurrence of the original wound, refusing the neat separation between then and now that psychological health requires. The relationship between the director's Italian background and the film's American protagonist and North African setting creates a transnational production context that complicates any simple reading of the film's cultural politics. Guaglione and Resinaro are not American filmmakers uncritically celebrating American military values. They are European artists using American characters and African landscapes to explore universal themes of fear and paralysis. This displacement may excuse some of the film's representational failures, but it may also compound them, adding a layer of European Orientalism to the American variety already present in the narrative structure. The film's depiction of military technology as simultaneously powerful and useless speaks to a broader critique of techno-fetishism that runs beneath the surface of the thriller mechanics. The sniper rifle that can kill from impossible distances cannot help Mike when he is immobilized. The radio that connects him to command cannot transmit his coordinates. The GPS that should locate him anywhere on Earth has broken at the crucial moment. Each technological failure strips away another layer of the fantasy that equipment can substitute for courage, that gadgets can eliminate vulnerability, that the right gear can make the world safe. The child Mike's relationship with toy soldiers deserves psychoanalytic attention as an instance of what Freud called the Fort de game, the child's attempt to master absence and loss through symbolic repetition. The toy soldiers can be deployed, lost, found, destroyed, and reconstituted. They allow the child to rehearse scenarios of power and vulnerability in a controlled environment where the stakes are imaginary. Adult Mike's enlistment extends this game into reality, but the game's logic remains unchanged. Play it being a soldier, follow the rules, and the violence will remain safely symbolic. The mind explodes this fantasy, confronting him with the real stakes that the game was designed to defer. The sandstorm sequence, beyond its technical accomplishment, functions as what anthropologist Victor Turner would call a liminal phase, a period of radical disorientation in which normal social structures and categories break down and the individual enters a state of pure potentiality. During the storm, Mike is neither soldier nor civilian, neither alive nor dead, neither sane nor mad. He is suspended between all categories, and this suspension, though terrifying, creates the conditions for transformation. When the storm passes and he is still alive, he has been changed in ways that the rest of the film will slowly reveal. The film's engagement with the ethics of survival raises questions that it does not fully answer, but that it places before the audience with genuine urgency. Is survival always the highest value? At what cost does survival become meaningful? Mike does nothing heroic during his ordeal. He simply endures. His survival depends on luck, on the mind not being real, on factors entirely outside his control. The film thus challenges the survival genre's usual celebration of human agency and resourcefulness, suggesting that survival is often less about what we do than about what happens to us, a humbling perspective that cuts against the grain of American individualism. The Berber's lost daughter is mentioned only briefly, but her absence haunts the film like a negative space around which the visible action organizes itself. She is the victim the film cannot show, the civilian cost of the mines that the military narrative marginalizes, the grief that the Berber carries without displaying. Her absence speaks louder than many of the film's explicit statements, because it gestures toward a world of suffering that exists beyond Mike's psychological journey, a world the film acknowledges but cannot, given its narrative commitments, fully enter. The film's visual effects, particularly in the sandstorm sequence and the dog attacks, serve the story without calling attention to themselves, achieving a transparency that represents craft at its highest level. The storm feels real because the sand that hits Mike's face is real sand, the wind that buffets his body is real wind, the disorientation that results is genuine rather than simulated. The effects work supports rather than replaces the practical elements, creating a hybrid realism that honors both the physical reality of the location and the narrative requirements of the scenario. The screenplay's structure adheres to a classical three-act architecture while making choices within that architecture that push against convention, particularly in the extended second act where external action nearly ceases and internal experience becomes the primary dramatic material. This is the riskiest structural gambit in contemporary commercial cinema, which typically demands regular injections of incident to maintain audience engagement. The director's willingness to trust their material and their actor through this extended stasis represents a commitment to their thematic vision that deserves acknowledgement even from critics who find the execution flawed. The flashback sequences depicting Mike's relationship with Jenny are illuminated differently than the childhood trauma scenes, with a warmer, more golden light that suggests the possibility of healing and connection that Mike's history has made difficult for him to access. Annabelle Wallis plays Jenny with a combination of patience and frustration that captures the experience of loving someone who cannot fully receive love, who holds back even in moments of apparent intimacy, who is one foot always hovering over the exit. Her performance provides the emotional stakes for Mike's journey without reducing her character to a mere prize awaiting his recovery. The film's title, considered in its full semantic range, operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Mine refers obviously to the landmine that immobilizes the protagonist, but it also invokes the possessive pronoun, suggesting the questions of ownership and identity that the narrative explores. What is mine? What belongs to me? What have I claimed as my own? Mike's ordeal forces him to examine what he actually possesses, his memories, his relationships, his fears, his capacity for courage, and to recognize that much of what he thought was his, including his military identity, has been borrowed or imposed rather than chosen. The theatricality of the single-location drama, with its roots in classical tragedy's unity of place, finds in Mine a cinematic translation that respects the constraint's generative power while exploiting the camera's ability to modulate distance and perspective. The stage cannot move closer to the actor, the camera can. The stage cannot show the vastness of the desert while simultaneously revealing the intimacy of a face, the camera can. This flexibility allows the film to have both the intensity of theatrical confinement and the expansiveness of cinematic landscape, a combination that serves its thematic concerns with interior and exterior, psyche and world. The feral dogs, as antagonists, represent a threat category distinct from both the human enemies of the sniper mission and the environmental dangers of desert and mine. They are neither malicious nor indifferent. They are hungry, following their nature, operating according to imperatives that have nothing to do with Mike's psychological journey or the film's thematic architecture. This radical otherness makes them, in some ways, the most frightening presence in the film, because they cannot be reasoned with, cannot be appealed to, cannot be incorporated into any symbolic framework. They simply are, and their being threatens his. The moment when Mike finally lifts his foot from the mine is choreographed with a deliberateness that transforms a simple physical action into a ritual of existential commitment. The slow motion, the held breath, the absence of music, the concentration on the boots separating from the sand. These elements combine to give the moment a ceremonial weight appropriate to its narrative significance. This is not merely a step. It is the step, the one that all the preceding steps of Mike's life have been avoiding, the one that will determine whether the rest of his life has any steps at all. The film's relationship to its audience is unusually demanding, requiring a level of patience and attention that commercial cinema rarely asks, and that some viewers will experience as tedium rather than immersion. The directors have made a wager that the intensity of identification with Mike's situation will sustain engagement through the long middle section, where very little happens externally, and this wager pays off for some viewers while failing for others. The division in critical and audience response reflects less a difference in discernment than a difference in willingness to accept the film's terms, to sit in the discomfort it creates rather than resisting that discomfort as boredom. The philosophical concept of amor fati, love of fate, the embrace of whatever happens as necessary and therefore, in some sense, good, finds expression in the Berber's attitude toward his own catastrophic history. He does not regret his lost leg or his lost daughter in the way Mike regrets his childhood or his hesitation. He has accepted them as part of his story, integrated them into his being, moved forward with them rather than in spite of them. This is not resignation but a kind of active reconciliation, and it stands as the film's most radical proposition. That suffering can be loved, not because it is pleasant, but because it is ours. The technical challenge of maintaining continuity across a shoot in which the lead actor must remain essentially motionless for extended periods requires a level of script supervision and performance consistency that the production, by all evidence, achieved admirably. Hammer's physical condition must deteriorate incrementally, and each stage of that deterioration must be tracked and replicated across multiple shooting days that were not filmed in chronological order. The seamless progression of his decline testifies to careful planning and meticulous execution, the invisible labor that supports visible craft. The film's relationship to the action genre is one of strategic negation, borrowing the genre's iconography. The sniper, the mission, the military hardware, while systematically refusing its satisfactions. The mission fails before it properly begins. The sniper never takes the shot. The extraction never arrives. The enemy never appears. Each negation strips away another generic expectation, clearing space for the psychological drama that the directors want to pursue, but also potentially alienating viewers who came to the film expecting the pleasures its opening sequence seemed to promise. The Berber's English fluency, which might seem like a contrivance to facilitate the philosophical dialogue the film requires, can also be read as a marker of colonial history, the linguistic residue of British or American presence in North Africa that has left minds in the ground and English in the mouths of survivors. The Berber speaks Mike's language. Mike makes no attempt to speak the Berber's. This asymmetry, unremarked by the film, reproduces the broader asymmetries of power and attention that characterize the relationship between the global North and the regions it has militarized. The film's moral imagination, while limited by its focus on the protagonist's psychological journey, does contain moments of genuine ethical insight that deserve acknowledgement alongside the critiques of its representational failures. The recognition that courage is required even when, especially when, the threat is imaginary is not a trivial insight, but a genuinely useful contribution to the cultural conversation about fear and its management. Many of the obstacles that paralyze ordinary lives are, like Mike's mine, more perceived than real, and the film's insistence that the step must be taken anyway carries practical wisdom beyond its narrative context. The sunrise that greets Mike's liberation from the mine is filmed with a beauty that risks sentimentality, but earns its emotional effect through the suffering that precedes it. The cinematography shifts from the harsh, flat light of the ordeal to a softer, more golden illumination that suggests the world's capacity for renewal, the return of beauty after its apparent disappearance, the persistence of loveliness in a landscape that has seemed only hostile. This visual release mirrors the narrative release, giving the audience permission to feel the relief that Mike feels, to exhale after holding breath for the duration of his immobility. The final image of the film invites the audience to project their own conclusions onto Mike's future, to imagine the conversations with Jenny and the confrontations with memory that lie beyond the frame. This openness is a form of respect, a recognition that the film's business is to dramatize a transformation rather than to catalog its consequences, to show the moment of liberation rather than the life that follows from it. The step off the mine is an ending, but it is also a beginning, and the film trusts its audience to understand that without being shown.